DB Cooper pulled off the perfect sky heist and disappeared without a trace. Then, almost 10 years later, a jaw-dropping discovery reignited the mystery. In November 1971, a man known only as DB Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 with a briefcase and a calm demeanor. Airport security was almost non-existent, and no one suspected a thing until it was far too late. What happened next would spark one of the greatest mysteries in American history. The true identity of DB Cooper, also known as Dan Cooper, has never been confirmed, despite decades spent attempting to close the mystery of his case. He's basically a ghost who will haunt the imagination of men and women alike forever. However, what he did that November evening is forever marked in history, and perhaps it holds some real clues that are worth another look. The entire fiasco started on the eve of American Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. That night, a nondescript man entered Portland International Airport. He was a white male in his late 40s, according to eyewitnesses. He wore a dark-coloured suit paired with brown shoes, a thin black tie, and a black raincoat. He looked like every other passenger in the airport that night, except for one little detail. If there was one thing that may have made Cooper stand out to people watching that night, it may have been his lack of luggage. Cooper approached the flight counter with only a briefcase and a brown paper bag in his hand, which may have raised a few eyebrows. However, perhaps people reasoned he could have been a businessman attempting to return home for the holiday weekend. That, paired with another notable fact, likely helped him escape any suspicion. Cooper approached the flight counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. He brought a one-way ticket to Seattle on flight number 305, a short trip up north. It would only take them 30 minutes to leave Portland and arrive at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It's likely no one thought anything particularly dangerous could happen in 30 minutes of airtime, but they'd soon discover the truth. Cooper paid cash for his ticket. As such, he left no trace of himself at the ticketing counter. Even his name was that of a ghost. His ticket listed his identity as Dan Cooper. However, in the days, months, and years to follow, no one by that name would turn up. That night, Dan Cooper, the businessman, was just one of many passengers looking to get to their final destination. Only Cooper knew that they definitely wouldn't have a smooth arrival. When it came time to board, Cooper got on the plane just like all of the other passengers. He moved to the back of the plane where he took the last seat in the last row, 18E. You'll want to remember that for later. While they were waiting to take off, Cooper was calm. He even ordered a drink from the flight attendant, a bourbon and 7-Up. He was biding his time. Commercial travel was not the massive business that it is today, especially on such a short trip. Cooper was one of 36 passengers that were aboard the plane that day. On top of that, there were just 6 crew members, the captain and the first officer, a flight engineer, and 3 flight attendants. Veterans of flying, none of them had any idea that this was anything other than a typical flight. Flight 305 took off without issue. They left at 2:50 PM PST, local for Portland, exactly on time. It wasn't until the plane had taken off and began coasting that Cooper began to behave strangely. Yet, even then, it took the flight attendants a while to notice anything was wrong. Cooper's plan was almost thwarted before it even started. Remember, Cooper sat at the back of the plane, in the very last seat in the row. This put him directly in front of the plane's jump seat, where one of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner, was sitting. Once the plane was in the air, Cooper passed Schaffner a note. Schaffner, however, didn't react the way that Cooper expected her to. Schaffner had been a flight attendant for a while, and a woman for even longer. A man slipping you a note of folded paper was not an unusual experience. She assumed that Cooper was making a pass at her, and had offered her his number. Cooper's entire plan hinged on Schaffner reading the note that he had passed her. Therefore, he couldn't let her slip it into her purse without even reading it. Seeing that Schaffner had not done as he'd hoped, Cooper leaned back to inform her of the mistake that she'd just made. He whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Cooper suddenly had her attention. Schaffner did as he requested and retrieved the note out of her bag. The instructions were quite simple. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and want you to sit by me." Schaffner understood the gravity of the situation. She quietly got up and gave Cooper what he wanted. Once Schaffner had seated herself beside Cooper, she did the most logical thing: assessed the situation. After all, anyone can claim to have an explosive. Therefore, she asked Cooper to show his bomb to her. He opened the briefcase to reveal what looked like just what he had claimed to have: 4 red cylinders that looked like dynamite attached to wire and a battery. Cooper had made his point. Now that Cooper had gotten her attention and provided evidence to back up his claim of danger, he could give Schaffner his demands. Captain William A. Scott memorialized those demands with his message to Northwest Flight Operations. Cooper requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m. He wants 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes. He wants the money in a negotiable American currency. As you've probably guessed by now, Cooper had specific reason for making his demands so specific. As you may have noticed, Cooper demanded 2 sets of parachutes. This led the authorities to believe that he planned to take a hostage with him. That effectively stopped them from supplying him with parachutes that wouldn't function. The exchange of demands caused some rearrangements within the plane as well. When Schaffner went to the cockpit to inform Captain Scott of their problem, Scott instructed her to remain there and take notes of events for the record. With Schaffner now in the cockpit, Cooper got a new companion in the back, one of the other flight attendants, Tina Mucklow. Cooper happily let Mucklow know he wasn't quite finished with his requests. Once the cockpit was aware of his initial demands, Cooper felt that he had more to get out of the situation. Now with Mucklow acting as liaison for him, Cooper asked for a few more things. First, he wanted fuel trucks to meet the plane when they landed in Seattle. He demanded the passengers stay seated and for Mucklow to bring the money on board. Cooper promised to release the passengers once he had his money. A seemingly perfect plan. Almost. Cooper's full demands triggered a relay race of actions. The flight attendants informed Captain Scott, who informed Air Traffic Control at SeaTac. Air Traffic Control then contacted the Seattle police, who finally got the FBI involved in the situation. Now, most people don't have experience collecting ransom demands for an airplane hijacking, but logic states that it takes time to collect all the necessary pieces, at least longer than a 30-minute flight. As a result, the flight began circling Puget Sound for the next 2 hours. The other passengers were told their flight was being delayed because of minor mechanical difficulty. However, considering the next series of events, they likely suspected something much bigger was wrong. For one thing, the passengers barely received service from 2 of the 3 flight attendants on board. Cooper forced Mucklow to remain at his side during the entire flight, furthering his case that he intended to take a hostage with him when he left. But Mucklow discovered one thing about Cooper during this period of waiting. It seemed like Cooper was familiar with the local area. Staring out the window, he remarked that it looks like Tacoma down there. He also knew that McCord Air Force Base, where the parachutes were coming from, was only 20 minutes from the airport. So was he a local? No one seems to know. He's surprised in other ways too. Cooper appeared to be happy to chat with Mucklow for the majority of the flight. Mucklow, who likely spent the most time with the mysterious Cooper, later remarked that he was not nervous, he seemed rather nice, and he was not cruel or nasty. This begs the question, who was Cooper? And what did he expect to get from all of this? What really was his end goal? Cooper gave some hints to Mucklow about his motivations while they chatted, though he did not appear to want to talk about himself. He told Mucklow that it's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge. He went on to explain that the flight served his needs. However, he became agitated and refused to answer when Mucklow began asking where he was from. At 5:24 PST, after around 2 hours of circling the area, the team on the ground delivered on the last part of Cooper's demands, the parachutes, and they began their descent. They landed 20 minutes later, parking on a distant, partially lit runway. Al Lee, Northwest Seattle's operations manager, approached in his civilian clothes as there was a fear Cooper would mistake his airline uniform for that of an officer. The exchange began. As requested when they were in the air, the passengers remained seated as Mucklow collected the money. Once she was back on board, the passengers were let off, and Cooper inspected the money. When Mucklow joked if she could have some, Cooper shocked her once again. He gave her a packet of bills willingly. She returned it, citing a policy about not accepting gratuities. Now, it was only Cooper and the 6 crew members left on the plane, and they looked to him for their next move. The strangeness of this tale isn't just in Cooper's disappearance, but also in his behaviour during the entire thing. He was friendly to Mucklow during the flight. He made jokes, and when the third flight attendant, Alice Hancock, asked if the flight attendants could leave, he told them whatever you girls would like. Hancock and Schaffner left, leaving Cooper, the captains and flight engineers, and Mucklow on board when the flight took off again. But with the supposed dangerous device still on board, they likely wondered if it might be their last one. After some delays with refueling, Cooper requested that the plane head southeast towards Mexico City. He demanded that they fly at as low a speed as possible, with the landing gear out and the wing flaps lowered. He also requested for the cabin to stay unpressurized. His final request, to fly with the rear exit door open, caused some extra issues. He gave in on that one for the moment, and at 7:40 PM they took off again. Cooper resolved the issue about the exit door being left open by saying they'd open it during flight. This was to be Mucklow's task. However, she feared being sucked out of the plane. After a heated argument with Cooper, who refused to let her grab the emergency cord to secure herself to a seat, she was finally sent to the cockpit, closing the partition between coach and first class as she went. He would open the door himself. Mucklow did as Cooper asked. However, she had one last request before she did so. She begged Cooper to take the device with him. He promised to disarm it or take it with him. The last Mucklow saw of Cooper, he was tying what she thought to be the money bag around his waist. It wasn't just Mucklow's last look though, it proved the last that any person ever saw of Cooper. No one is quite sure what happened to Cooper after this moment. Around 8 PM, a cockpit light flashed, informing the crew that Cooper had opened the staircase. Cooper was still on board at this time as he gave his last message. One word, no, in reply to Scott asking if he needed any help over the intercom. 13 minutes later, the aircraft's tail suddenly pitched forward, possibly when Cooper jumped. When the plane landed in Reno at 11:02 PM, Cooper was nowhere to be found. Once a crew deemed it safe to do so, the plane was immediately investigated. The FBI recovered the following: a Cooper's black clip-on tie and tie clip, 2 of the 4 parachutes, and 66 latent fingerprints. They interviewed eyewitnesses in Portland, Seattle, and Reno. From this, they developed composite sketches, which are all that remains of D.B. Cooper today. But, of course, that wasn't necessarily the end of the story. As you may recall, they'd identified Cooper by the ticket that he had purchased in Portland. However, that said ticket said Dan Cooper. The alias D.B. Cooper was an error made by James Long of the Oregon Journal. In a rush to meet a deadline, Long misprinted the name, and as other media sources picked it up, D.B. Cooper stuck. However, no one under the name Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper has been turned up to meet the description of the mysterious hijacker. One other precaution should have yielded more information. 3 jets from a nearby National Guard mission had been following the flight when it took off from Seattle heading for Reno. But even so, no one saw Cooper jumping from the plane. The jets were kept back so Cooper could not spot them, and given the darkness of the night, it was too difficult to spot one man jumping into the blackness. This, combined with other factors, made it extremely difficult to identify Cooper's flight path once he had jumped out of the plane. That didn't make them give up the search though. Despite the difficulties in identifying Cooper's exact landing location, they used the data that they did have to mark the zone as the southernmost outreach of Mount St. Helens. They searched this area, which was mostly forested, focusing on Clark and Cowlitz counties. However, nothing was ever found. Neither Cooper nor any of the equipment he jumped off the plane with turned up. One reason that nothing turned up for Cooper may have been that they were not looking in the correct area. In March 1972, new research determined that their initial summaries about where Cooper would have disappeared were incorrect. Based on the new research, investigators believe that Cooper likely jumped over La Center, Washington. But even that update didn't yield any new results. The FBI left the investigation open for 45 years. However, despite looking into the incident for this entire time, they never discovered anything significant that would suggest who D.B. Cooper was, nor what happened to him. Finally, in 2016, they closed the case. All their collected evidence is now open to the public, and many amateur sleuths still take up the case to this day. And lo and behold, one piece of evidence remained undiscovered. In 1980, a civilian named Brian Ingram was on vacation with his family on the Columbia River in the Washington area when he discovered something strange. 3 packets of cash deteriorated by the elements but still in their rubber bands. FBI techs confirmed these to be a portion of the ransom money, arranged exactly as given to Cooper almost 10 years earlier, with one exception. One pile was missing 10 bills. Too exact a number for chance. If they ended up there naturally, they should have floated separately and would have turned up 2 or 3 years later, not 10. And other testing supports that they couldn't have ended up in the water until several months after Cooper jumped. So, in the end, the bills just continue to add to the mystery. Initially, the FBI concluded that there was no way that Cooper could have survived his jump. Many still believe that as the ransom money was never spent, where did Cooper and the money go, if not into the afterlife? However, in the years that followed, several copycats made similar jumps, and most survived, with far less skill than Cooper appeared to have. In other words, he could still be out there, or perhaps someone who knew him and his plans could. Over the years, many men have been linked to the Cooper case, either by self-confession or theories made by strangers and loved ones alike. However, in every case, something doesn't add up. Perhaps one of these men is D.B. Cooper. Or maybe not. It's been over 50 years and we still don't have any answers. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.